Everything's changing in PR these days. So now what? These days, AI is deciding which stories get surfaced, cited, and repeated. If a company hasn't clearly defined who it is, what it stands for, and how it talks about itself, the cost shows up later in rework, misinterpretation, and public correction. Today, we're unpacking what founder readiness for comms and marketing really means in an AI-driven media landscape, why clarity beats polish, how earned media shapes discovery, and what founders need locked in before the spotlight hits.
Hey, Michelle, welcome to your first Now What? We're so excited that you're here. And today we're talking about this really important topic of founder readiness in the age of AI. So really excited to get into this conversation with you.
Thanks, James. Happy to be here. We've worked with a lot of founders over the years, and AI feels like a shortcut, but I think we're here to talk about that. It's really not. Wondering your thoughts right now on founder readiness, what that actually means, and why it's different than it was a few years ago.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the biggest misconception about what AI has done to, make figuring out your positioning kind of easier is that, it's really not. The basics of PR still matter more than ever. What AI does is kind of amplify what you talk about and makes it kind of faster to get it out there. But if you don't have if you don't feed these models with really clear positioning, and you're not totally lockstep across your organization with what it is we want to say in a really clear and kind of repeatable fashion, then these AI models will kind of take it upon themselves to fill in the gaps, right? And they'll echo kind of whatever it is they can find out there in the world, right? And that may not be exactly how you want to show up in front of your key audiences, right? Having clear messaging still matters, and it's even more important so that you have control over what it is that you want to say, right? Because now there's AIs that can, go and try to speak on your behalf, and they don't always get it right. In fact, most times they don't. So founders will we've seen it, that they'll kind of treat messaging as an ongoing kind of evolving exercise, right? And your messaging to an extent should change over time as your company grows and matures and you're talking to different audiences. When you want to start doing PR for the first time and you want to start showing up in, earned media sources for the first time, right? It's not something that you can kind of just figure out on the fly. You've really got to put in the work at the beginning. It's foundational, but it's really, really critical so that those errors and misrepresentations don't happen. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The last place that you want to be defining who you are is when you're being asked publicly. And I've seen that with founders over and over and over again. Founder readiness means the company has done the work to clearly define who they are, what they stand for, and how they explain it long before the spotlight ever hits. I think the issue sometimes is that it's hard work. It forces the founders to slow down, bring in other stakeholders, and align on who and what the company actually is. I often joke that it's like corporate therapy, not because it's fluffy or anything, but because it requires those kind of honest conversations that usually get skipped when everyone's moving so fast. And like you said, if that foundation isn't set, in the age of AI, that story doesn't pause. It starts to fill itself in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I kind of envision toothpaste out of a tube, right? Pre-AI, if your founder went and said something in an interview and didn't really like how he said it, right, and wants to kind of go back and revisit the messaging he used, he could do that on the next interview, right? You could go and kind of establish your positioning, right? Now an AI model is going to see that first interview, right, and that's going to become foundational knowledge to that model, right? And that stuff's going to show up, it's going to echo on, down the road, right? There's less room for error now. I think you got to get the stuff nailed at the beginning before you go out and try to say who you are and what you do, right, and why it matters. So it seems kind of simple and it seems kind of obvious, but it's something that in the age of we want to move fast and we break things and all that, right? It's not something that you can just kind of take for granted and figure out on the way, right? And like you said, that is sometimes a difficult process for founders, right? They want to just go, and they need that kind of therapy to, all right, is this right? Is that right? And you can go round and round, and it's frustrating. It can take time, but it's critically important.
And like you said, In the past, founders could rely on context and conversation to carry nuance a little more than they can today. Today, the way your company gets described is shaped by what's already been said, written, and repeated. Founder readiness is about making sure that when others speak on your behalf, they're pulling from something intentional and consistent. And I think people think it's a vanity exercise sometimes, but it's definitely an efficiency one. When the clarity exists, everything else moves faster. When it doesn't, your team spends time correcting, even clarifying, and walking things back instead of pushing that momentum.
Yep, exactly right. We always talk about how are you different from your competitors or existing solutions in the market, right? And if you don't have that clear differentiated, kind of positioning from the beginning, right? Like your positioning might blend in with your competitors' positioning, and then you're just confusing, your potential customers in the market about like, wait, I thought this company does this and this company does that, and I don't really understand how you're different than this, right? So you're just creating that confusion. So it's not only hurting kind of how you show up in media, but it could also hurt your sales process. It could also hurt when you're hiring and looking for talent, right? Like you're not necessarily clearly stating who you are and what you're looking for. So it has a trickle down effect kind of throughout the organization.
That just got me thinking, because there's such a foundational narrative infrastructure that needs to be in place even before a founder startup goes on to think about getting early press. And in the age of AI, we're learning that the algorithms and the AI engines are prioritizing earned media. So wondering your thoughts on that and how founders should approach press early on.
Yeah, so it goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Like the basics of PR and communications are still super important here. And so having your ducks in a row about what it is you want to say, having a clear idea of what it is you want to go talk about and who you want to go talk about it to is critically important, right? Like, so for an early stage founder who doesn't have a lot of media coverage out there, right? The startup's relatively new, they might be tempted to fall into the trap of kind of like any press is good press at that stage, right? We just want to get our name out there. We hear that a lot, right? And that's fine if you are ready to go with you're intentional about what it is you want to say and who you want to say it to, right? Like, yeah, we'd all love to go get like, a TechCrunch piece or a, Wall Street Journal piece right out of the gate, right? Well, if you're not ready to go and that interview goes south or it doesn't even go south, but doesn't go the way you clearly wanted it to, again, you feel the reverberations of that, right? So I would say to founders, like, who are your most important audiences that you need to speak to, right? And that should be pretty straightforward. Like, all right, if we're a health tech startup, we want to be talking to healthcare providers, health systems, right? Okay, where do those audiences read stuff, right? Health tech trades. Certainly other publications as well. But if you're a first timer and you're kind of just dipping your toe in, maybe you kind of start with like the vertical press, right? Where you might be a little bit safer and it's not as big of a, as big of a leap to just hit the ground running. And so I would start there. I would also be really clear about, again, like why are we doing this, right? What are we trying to signal to the market? Do we want to tell them about this cool technology that we have and why it matters? Are we looking for potential partnerships or potential customers, right? All of these questions kind of lead to different ways of what you might want to say to a reporter, right?
In terms of earned media and AI now prioritizing that as what it searches for and what it quotes, I want to point out that we're learning that it's not just the tier one press that AI is gravitating towards. It is actually prioritizing significantly different trade press as it pertains to different verticals that we might be working with, whether that's healthcare or clean tech. And I think for me, what that really drives home is the importance of partnering with an agency, a PR agency, a communications agency, because they have that deep understanding of how that trade landscape works. They have the history of relationships there. And I think to me, more than ever, it drives home that Tier One, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, those are great hits, but focusing on the trade organizations that pertain to your company are perhaps more important than ever.
Yeah. And you can't rely on getting multiple tier one hits every year, right? Or on every announcement, right? So certain things are just more appropriate for the trade journals, right? Some of those conversations are going to be more relevant to those trade audiences too, right? And so we know relevance matters a lot in what AI models are pulling from. We always say don't overlook the trades. They can have kind of an outsized impact for your business than you might realize.
Yeah, I agree. And I think they're even more important to founders and earlier stage startups because that's where they're setting the stage, the foundation for their message as they go on and scale. So I think focusing on those trade publications is much more mission critical for earlier stage startups.
And I think press releases now too. The press release was dead, right? We all heard that. And I don't think that that's necessarily the case anymore because we're seeing that press releases are a common input that AI models will cite. And so at least with, a press release, you've got almost total control over what it is you say in there, right? And so let's be like really intentional and clear about what it is we're going to put in our press release. A lot of times we trained ourselves press releases are just something you can kind of slap together and they're not that important and you just get it out there to get the news out there. Well, now they have taken on this added importance that I'm not sure everybody necessarily realizes, just how useful that can be as a tool.
Now, I think it's music to a PR person's heart to hear that the press releases come back. I smiled when you said that. Muckrak's recent What is AI reading report actually said that AI is citing press releases 5 times more than it did even 6 months ago back in July. So that's a really positive signal for us about the importance of the press release. It tells us that structure beats spin, so to speak, right? These press releases that once had little value or supposed little value, as PR people, we know that is not true, because they've always created a durable reference point that journalists can go back to and build upon over time. And now they're doing that same thing for AI, right? It's telling the story. And I've always advised founders and earlier startups to do those press releases because they tell the story and a journalist can go back and reference where you were and where you're going. What's especially telling about the resurgence of the press release and what AI is, citing from those press release is a few things. They are including concrete statistics, data that supports their claims. They're not making vague claims. They're using structure and bullet points to drive the information home. They rely on direct action-oriented language, so no fluff here. They're containing a higher share of objective statements, getting away from the hype, the best of, the disruptive sort of language that we've all become very used to seeing. They clearly define specific products, company, and facts, and they've aligned that boilerplate at the end of a press release. They've aligned on who they are and what they are, and how they differentiate from their competitors. And that is what we are seeing AI prioritize picking up in a press release. And I think it's an important time to make sure that comms organizations and founders and startups are prioritizing the factual, data-driven nature of a press release.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been talking about this within the context of media relations too, right? And what we put out, in press releases and things like that. Matters on websites too, right? And LinkedIn and various other places, right? Like AI has made it so that there's really no room to hide anything. So if you don't have a really clear boilerplate, as you mentioned, right? If your website is not articulating exactly what it is you do in a clear and concise way, there's more opportunities to confuse the model, right? You got to kind of check all these boxes, right? It's a frequent thing where we see organizations will be like, we don't really have a boilerplate. All right, well, we need to write one before we go do anything, right? Or, our website doesn't really do a good job of capturing, who it is we serve, or it doesn't do it as well as it should, right? Well, we got to get that figured out too then before we go put anything out, be it a press release or go talk to a reporter, right? It's, again, I keep going back to it, the basics of a communications program, each one of these buckets or each one of these like outlets is an opportunity to influence the AI models, right? And if you're kind of overlooking one, you're undermining potentially what shows up when people look for you or try to research you. So yeah, it matters across the board, not just in media relations.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what we were talking about even as we started this conversation, the importance of who you are, what you are, and why you're doing it, and making sure that that is communicated across your platforms, from website, employee communications, social media, etc. Everyone needs to be aligned so that when you are taking that message to the public, to the press, to investors, they're all on the same page. And then you're not correcting yourself much later on. Because how often have we seen teams forced to react to messaging, especially around different inflection points, right? Where a funding raise, a launch, or a spike in interest, coverage is starting to roll in. And then the company realizes different outlets are describing them in different ways. And then they're scrambling to align on messages midstream, where if they had done that earlier, they would avoid that loss of momentum, which honestly costs real money because you're wasting time.
Yeah. And we always have talked about how it's critical to just, to our success as an agency, that the founder is bought into what we're doing, right? And that they agree, in whatever direction it is we're going, right? And from a messaging standpoint, your founder that you're working with needs to not only like agree and be good at repeating the messaging over and over wherever it is, they also need to advocate for that messaging across the organization too. Because like, how many times have we seen that, sales will say, we always talk about our product this way, and marketing will talk about their product in another way, right? And again, if there's not that unified voice across the organization, and if it's not coming down from the top, saying like, this is who we are and this is what we say when we're in conversations with people, then if you're not pulling in the same direction, right? Again, you're just creating those opportunities for your messaging to get muddied.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the burden is not on the media or AI to define that narrative. It sits with the company.
Right.
And when messaging hasn't been clearly defined and aligned on, like you said, internally and reinforced across stakeholders, the market's just going to fill in those gaps for you. Fixing that later is just harder, more expensive than setting that clearly from the start. So definitely advice to founders: sit down and do that hard work on defining who you are, what you are, and why you're doing it much earlier on.
I'm curious then what your advice would be. A very common kind of client onboarding experience is client comes to us and says, all right, we're ready to make an announcement. I call it a funding announcement, for example, right? We want to announce this funding in 2 weeks, and we want to go to, these 3 publications. Can you guys make it happen for us, right? And of course the answer is yes, but like when you're balancing kind of a tight, desired timeline, what's your advice to founders on like kind of pumping the brakes and making sure all of the like, A, B's and C's are ready to go before it is? Like, how do you strike that balance? What would your advice to a founder be?
Yeah, I like to keep it simple, right? So if you align on 4 things: the core narrative, a simple, clear explanation of what you're doing, not 5 versions of it, not sliding definitions depending on the audience, one story everyone can repeat. Second, you need some boundaries, positioning boundaries. Just as important as what you are is what you are not. So this prevents, some lazy comparisons and headlines that you didn't ask for. Third, I think the founder's default language needs to be defined. The phrases that they naturally use when they explain the company, because those words are going to get quoted, repeated, and picked up by AI. So I think that's mission critical. And lastly, the 4th point, you need proof points, data that match the story, not aspirational claims, not where you're hoping to be in 2 years, but real defensible signals that journalists and AI can actually cite. If those 4 things aren't set, every press hit becomes a negotiation instead of like the amplifier that you want it to be. And that's when momentum slows down, when you really can't afford it to.
I think you're spot on there. I mean, we're not afraid to tell a founder, hey, like I know you want to move fast, like you've got, business reasons to get this announcement out, but we need those 4 things in place, right? Before we can promise you that there's going to be success at the end of this. Not just because we say so, but because reporters are going to look for that too, right? They need to have all of that in mind as well.
We tell founders, just slow down once and then everything else can move faster, right? So let's do this one thing early, define the narrative that we want others to repeat, and then go, right? So I think that so often founders get away from that and just slow down, and then we can move faster.
If you can train your founders that you work with to get that market feedback, and if it's from an analyst firm, perhaps, like how is this landing with the people that actually buy your product and influence buying decisions, right? Like get all that feedback in the door first before you go out on some big media relations campaign, right? Absolutely. That should be the execution of that media relations campaign kind of is the second part of this, right? And everybody kind of thinks that's the first part, and the coverage that shows up at the end is the second part. And there's really a, kind of that foundational piece that you got to work on before any of that happens.
Right. It's just like, remember to do those 3 things: what problem you solve, who you solve it for, and why it matters now. And then I think one thing that's important is to pressure test that internally, make sure the stakeholders agree, and make sure all your teams use the same language. Because as I said before, the worst time to figure out who you are is when someone is asking you publicly. But one thing I want to remind people is that these messages are not static. This work that you do in the beginning needs to be revisited, especially when your company is changing fast. You might be pivoting due to a new technology. I recommend, at the minimum quarterly, going back and looking at, is this still who we are? Is this still what we want to be? And making sure that becomes standard practice for your organization, so that a year or 2 doesn't go by and you look back and be like, well, that's not who we are anymore. It's because it is not a static situation. It is a constant evolution.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that's where, we come into, is helping them read and understand the conversations that are happening in the media outlets that matter to them, right? We recently onboarded a new client that is more of a AI kind of technology first team, but they're operating in the healthcare space. And they asked us like, hey, we need your help understanding like what is important within a healthcare conversation, right? That we can insert ourselves into. And so, messaging might be ready to go for, kind of one avenue that they want to go down, right? But they need our help kind of calibrating and acid testing, as you said, that messaging to make sure it lands with, different markets that they're trying to make inroads with.
Yeah, completely agree. Okay, James, I know that our landscape is changing, and AI has all of us rethinking how we work. What's a hot topic, or what's a hot thing that we should be paying attention to this year?
Yeah, Muckrak's December report revealed that more than half of the citations that AI pulls are, from the last year, right? And even more so, like within the last 7 days, those kinds of results are pulled, even more frequently, right? So I think something to keep an eye on is if that trend is going to continue in 2026, right? Like I do find it hard to believe that AI models are only going to be pulling from stuff that happened in the last week going forward, right? But at least as of now, that seems to be the case. So that'll be something to keep an eye on for sure. It kind of underscores, again, like the importance of having recent and relevant content out there that these models can pull from, right? So if you're an older company, more established company, right, and you've got a decent media footprint out there, what have you done recently to kind of update that positioning as your company has evolved over time, right? We see a lot of times that AI models pull stuff about kind of more established companies that reflects kind of who they used to be, right? So that'll be something to keep an eye on for sure in the new year.
Yeah, it's like the AI search engines are thinking, well, what have you done lately? So that drives home the need to make sure content is updated, blogs are recent, LinkedIn is active, and you're actively going after that earned media, which we now know AI prioritizes as a source.